Let's go live to Peter Dutton now. He's the opposition leader standing by. He's not going to be at the Jobs Summit, but we can all see what needs to be done. So, Peter Dutton, outcomes from this summit. It looks like there are going to be some. There's still a risk this becomes a talk fest, and the guest list is very union heavy. Does that matter?
Good morning, Laura. Well, of course it matters. The union representation in the workforce at the moment is less than 10%. And yet we've got 33 union officials sitting around a table of 142. So I think this union summit really is going to be top-heavy, and the small business community, like the one that I'm here at today, is going to be completely overlooked. And I think that is a travesty because of the millions of Australians who are employed through small business, and they're often left out at the expense of the big end of town. And the unions have an agenda including forcing up taxation, making it more difficult in terms of compliance costs, and economy-wide strikes, which would be devastating for small businesses and big, as well as employees. So there's a lot of expectation coming out of this union summit, but we'll see what can be put forward.
What does success look like in your view, particularly on skills and migration? Does this summit need to come up with a number and also some practical steps when it comes to getting more workers here?
Well, I think there'll be some big headlines that come out of it, and frankly I think many of the policy outcomes have already been written by the Prime Minister's office in concert with the ACTU. So there'll be a lot of claim about success, and the parties have come together, there's been compromise and all the rest of that rhetoric. The real test will be whether the numbers are achieved, how quickly they can deal with the processing times of visas of workers who are needed in workplaces now, whether they pick up the policy that we've suggested around getting older Australians into the workforce, because that is a work-ready grey army that can be deployed tomorrow into businesses that are screaming out for staff. There'll be those sort of tangibles that they can announce, but the question will be whether they can actually give effect to it over the course of the next few months.
Well, allowing pensioners to work more before their payments are affected. Anthony Albanese actually said in a radio interview recently it was his idea first.
Well, I mean, this guy spent 26 years trying to be Prime Minister, and he spent every day since then being the Leader of the Opposition. It's quite remarkable, and I think the country wants a Prime Minister to step up. And yes, they're in a honeymoon period at the moment, I accept that, but the fact is that we suggested this back in June, and it hasn't been adopted. It should have been adopted back then. The government should have swallowed its pride and said, OK, well, you know, the Liberal Party suggested this, but we think it's in our country's best interest and therefore we'll adopt it. That's the approach I've taken as opposition leader, is to be positive and support good government initiatives, and we'll continue to do that. But we made a sensible suggestion. It's the only way that really you can get people quickly into the workforce. Even if there's a big number announced in migration, it'll take months and months, in some cases 12 months, for those people to be processed and to be job ready. And the beauty about the veteran workforce, those that are on a pension or those that are on an age pension, or in fact if the government extends it to people on New Start, for example, if the economy does contract, if the labour market does tighten, those people have got a safety net to go back to. So there are good reasons why you would want to do that from an economic perspective, but also from just a well-being perspective for those people that were desperate to get out of the workforce but have worked out over a couple of years in retirement that they just retired too early. And those people who choose to work should be given that choice.
Where you are in Lilydale at that small business morning, I'm sure they're crying out for workers as well. It's the same situation for businesses, big or small. I mean, we can all be experts in hindsight, but was it a mistake for Scott Morrison to stand up in the middle of a pandemic and say to visa holders and some of these workers filling those skills shortages that it was time to go home and they weren't going to get a safety net here? Is that a mistake? Was that a mistake?
Well, Laura, I think you've got to look at it in the context of the time. At the time, and frankly until only recent months, I mean, the claims about the lack of ventilators, the lack of ability to deal with people who contracted COVID, the aged care situation, the demands on our health workers and aged care workers across society meant that the advice to government was that there wasn't enough capacity within the health system to provide support to Australians, let alone those who are here as as visitors or as tourists, etc. So I think it's all good and well in hindsight, but that's the difficulty that Scott Morrison was dealing with at the time, and I think he made the best decisions that he could in our country's best interests, and sort of the rewrite of history is probably not a fair one.
We're living with COVID, but it's still costing us. $750 payments are still being made for people with COVID to isolate. The states don't require close contacts to isolate, but still these $750 payments are being made. National Cabinet is meeting today. Surely they need to sort this out.
Well, I hope they do, frankly. I think the mandating of masks on planes, I'd be surprised if the health advice hasn't shifted in relation to that. And if people want to wear a mask, if that's their choice, well, of course they can do that. But the mandating of it is not consistent with what we're seeing by way of practice in other countries. The $750 I do think needs to be reviewed as well, because many small business employers that you speak to talk about that being a problem for them to get staff back. And as Jennifer pointed out before, you want staff to come back when they're healthy and to take time off when they're sick, but not to take advantage of the situation. So I think there's a common sense approach that can be applied there. And I support Dominic Perrottet's proposal around reducing the 7 days down to at least 5. I think we do need to live with COVID now. That's the reality. And where I am in Victoria, I mean, the number of families I've spoken to, with young girls, I've got to say in particular, who have either self-harmed or now have developed mental health issues that are really acute as a result of COVID and the isolation that they suffered. We've got to move beyond this now, and we've got to normalise society and deal with COVID as we do other viruses and diseases, and be sensible in our response to it. But we live now with COVID, I think, for the rest of our lives. That's the reality. But the treatments, the responses, the immunisations, all of that medical advancement will continue to take place, and that allows us to live with it in a way that we couldn't back in 2020, when there was no vaccination, there was no treatment, and people were dying at a very significant rate across Europe. I mean, we averted many of those deaths because of the decisions that we took as a government at that point. But we need to respond to the here and now, and I hope the Premiers and the Prime Minister can achieve that outcome.